What if everything you believed about right and wrong, about good and evil, was a lie? Not just wrong, not just mistaken, but a lie told deliberately, centuries ago, by people who wanted to keep you small. That's the question Friedrich Nietzsche spent his life asking, and over 100 years after his death, we still don't have a comfortable answer. He died in 1900. Almost no one read his works while he was alive. And yet, right now, today, he is one of the most searched philosophers on the internet. His quotes flood social media. He shows up in Reddit threads, YouTube essays, self-improvement communities, meta lyrics, and film school syllabuses. Every few years, a new subculture rediscovers him and claims him as their own. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because the questions he asked are the ones that won't stay buried, and because he wrote in a way that hits like a punch rather than a lecture. So who was he? What did he actually believe? And why does a 19th century German philosopher with a catastrophic personal life still feel this urgent? Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 in Prussia, modern-day Germany. His father was a Lutheran pastor who died when Nietzsche was just 4 years old. He grew up in a house full of women, his mother, his sister, his grandmother, and 2 aunts. He was brilliant from childhood. By his mid-20s, he was already a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel, one of the youngest ever appointed to that position. He hadn't even finished his PhD. He served briefly as a medical orderly in the Franco-Prussian War. He saw enough to break something in him. Or maybe to clarify it. He never married. He had few close friends. He struggled his entire life with crippling headaches and failing eyesight. He often wrote in short bursts, lying in a darkened room, in physical agony. And in 1889, while living alone in Turin, Italy, Nietzsche collapsed in the street. He never fully recovered. He spent his final 11 years in a state of mental collapse, unable to write, unable to work, cared for by his family. He died in 1900. Almost no one noticed. Then, the 20th century discovered his books, and everything changed. Nietzsche didn't found a school of thought. He didn't give us a system to follow. What he gave us was something more uncomfortable. A mirror. He looked at Western civilization, its religion, its morality, its philosophy, and asked a question no one wanted to ask. Why do you believe what you believe? Did you choose it, or were you just told? His influence reached everywhere. Sigmund Freud acknowledged him as a predecessor. Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Martin Heidegger all built on his foundations. Writers from Dostoevsky to Jack London to Thomas Mann wrestled with his ideas. Even pop culture is drenched in Nietzsche, from The Dark Knight to David Bowie to Fight Club. He was also grotesquely misused. After his death, his sister Elizabeth, who was a nationalist and anti-Semite, edited his unpublished notes and distorted his philosophy to align with ideas he had explicitly rejected. The Nazis later appropriated his image. This is one of history's great ironies, because Nietzsche himself despised nationalism and anti-Semitism in some of the most scorching language he ever wrote. The real Nietzsche is more interesting and more challenging than any caricature. She didn't just edit, she constructed. Elizabeth established the Nietzsche archive and made herself sole gatekeeper of his manuscripts. Then she assembled his private notes and abandoned fragments into a book she titled The Will to Power, presenting it as his masterwork. It wasn't. Nietzsche had abandoned that project himself. She chose which fragments to include, in what order, and framed the whole thing to emphasize domination and strength, while quietly burying his contempt for nationalism, his mockery of anti-Semites, his explicit rejection of everything she stood for. She then wrote the first major biography of her brother, which shaped how an entire generation understood him. In 1934, she invited Hitler to the archive for a public visit and photo opportunity. Hitler was photographed gazing at a bust of Nietzsche. She received a Nazi pension. When she died, Hitler attended her funeral. The man who called anti-Semites the scum of Germany was now the official philosopher of the Third Reich. Elizabeth had pulled off the one thing Nietzsche spent his life arguing against. She'd taken an idea and bent it into a weapon, and she'd used his own name to do it. This is his most famous line, and his most misunderstood. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. Nietzsche wasn't celebrating. He wasn't being flippant. He was describing a crisis. He saw that modern Europe had quietly stopped believing in the Christian God. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, through science, through philosophy, through doubt. And he thought almost no one had reckoned with what that actually meant. For centuries, God had been the foundation of Western morality, the source of meaning, the answer to death, the reason suffering was bearable. Without God, Nietzsche asked, where does meaning come from? What grounds your sense of right and wrong? What stops the whole moral architecture from collapsing? He wasn't asking rhetorically. He genuinely thought this was the great crisis of modernity. And he thought the honest response wasn't to pretend the crisis didn't exist. It was to face it and build something new. This is where Nietzsche gets dangerous, in the most interesting sense of the word. He looked at the history of morality and saw two fundamentally different systems at war. The first he called master morality. This was the morality of the strong, of ancient aristocrats, of warriors. In this system, good meant noble, powerful, excellent. Bad meant weak, contemptible, low. It wasn't about guilt. It wasn't about sin. It was about greatness. The second he called slave morality. And this, he argued, is where our modern moral system came from. When the powerless can't overcome the powerful through strength, they do something more clever. They redefine the game. Suddenly, weakness is humility. Suffering is virtue. Envy becomes justice. The strong are evil. The meek shall inherit the earth. Nietzsche called this the greatest act of revenge in history. He called it the revaluation of all values. Now, to be absolutely clear, Nietzsche was not saying we should go back to being brutal aristocrats. He was making a philosophical argument about how moral systems get constructed, and asking us to interrogate our own values. Who taught you what is good? And what did they have to gain from it? Everyone gets this wrong. Will to power sounds like Nietzsche was obsessed with domination, with crushing other people. He wasn't. The will to power is his theory of what fundamentally drives all living things. And it isn't pleasure. It isn't survival. It isn't happiness. It's growth, expression, becoming more fully what you are. A musician who practices until their fingers bleed isn't seeking comfort. A scientist who spends decades on a problem no one else thinks is solvable isn't optimizing for happiness. A person who disciplines themselves, who builds something, who creates, they're expressing the will to power. Nietzsche thought this drive, toward expansion, toward overcoming, was the most honest description of what life actually does. And he thought, any philosophy that tried to tame or suppress it was fighting against the current of existence itself. This is the idea that got most brutally distorted. The Übermensch, often translated as Superman or Overman, was Nietzsche's vision of what a human being could become after letting go of inherited values, after confronting the death of God, after taking full responsibility for creating their own meaning. The Übermensch isn't a race. It isn't a nationality. It has nothing to do with any of that. It's a type of person. Someone who doesn't need external validation, who creates their own values, who says yes to life fully and completely, who doesn't need suffering to have been worth it because someone else decided so. Nietzsche used Goethe as his closest example of what he meant. Not a conqueror, an artist, a man who organized the chaos of his own experience into something of lasting value. It was the perfect corruption, the philosophy of the self-created individual, the person who answers to no herd, no ideology, no mass movement, had been handed to the most murderous mass movement in history. And it had been done by his own sister, not by enemies, not by strangers, by Elizabeth. The one person who should have protected his legacy had instead sold it to everything he despised, and its new figurehead was a man Nietzsche would have found contemptible. Now, consider the irony. Nietzsche, during his lifetime, was long rumored to have contracted syphilis, the disease that, in the 19th century, carried the heaviest stigma and was blamed for madness and moral decay. Most serious historians now think he probably didn't have it. His illness was more likely hereditary and neurological. Hitler almost certainly did have syphilis. His personal physician treated him with drugs used specifically for syphilitic infection. The medical records strongly suggest it. So the man who probably didn't have syphilis gets smeared with it and dies in obscurity. The man who almost certainly did gets crowned the Übermensch, the pinnacle of human greatness, by a movement built on a philosophy he never held, transmitted through a sister who falsified his work to glorify everything he stood against. If Nietzsche had lived to see it, he might have called it the ultimate proof of his thesis, that human beings are extraordinarily good at taking ideas and bending them into weapons. This is the idea Nietzsche himself seemed to consider his most important and his most terrifying. Imagine that your life, every single moment of it, every joy, every humiliation, every ordinary afternoon will repeat, exactly as it happened, infinitely, forever. Not as a metaphor, as a thought experiment that forces the most honest question you can ask yourself. Would you want it again, and again, and again, without end? If the answer is no, if there's something in you that recoils from that idea, then Nietzsche says, look at that. That's information. You're living a life you wouldn't choose to repeat. What are you going to do about it? The person who could hear eternal recurrence and feel, not dread, but something like yes, that person, Nietzsche thought, had understood something essential, not because life is easy, but because they've made it theirs. Nietzsche died at 55, having spent his last decade unable to speak or write. He never knew he would become one of the most read philosophers in history. His ideas have been used and misused, celebrated and condemned. He has been claimed by fascists and anarchists, by existentialists and self-help gurus, by artists and scientists. Freud, Camus, Sartre, Bowie. The fingerprints are everywhere. And then there's the internet. Part of why Nietzsche dominates online is purely mechanical. He's endlessly quotable. He wrote in aphorisms, in short percussive lines that screenshot perfectly. God is dead. Without music, life would be a mistake. What does not kill me makes me stronger. These travel, but there's something deeper too. His entire project, reject the herd, question inherited values, create yourself from scratch, speaks directly to anyone in their late teens or 20s who suspects the script they've been handed doesn't fit. That demographic Googles obsessively. And Nietzsche rewards obsessive Googling because he's genuinely hard. One read doesn't settle it. You keep coming back. He also occupies a rare position, taught in universities, but feels transgressive, academic enough to be credible, edgy enough to feel like a discovery. That combination is almost impossible to manufacture. It just happens to describe him perfectly. What he actually was, beneath all of it, was something simpler and harder. Honest. He looked at the things human beings tell themselves to get through the day, the comfortable lies, the borrowed values, the inherited scripts, and he refused to look away. He wanted us to face existence without the safety net, not because he thought existence was meaningless, but because he thought meaning worth having had to be earned, created, chosen. He wrote, near the end of his productive life, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." Nietzsche is now a motivational poster. He was once a warning. His image was stolen. His sister sold the rights to his legacy to people he would have despised, and the 20th century used him as a prop for movements he'd have found contemptible. And yet, the books survive, unmediated, available to anyone willing to actually read them. Somewhere between the motivational poster and the Nazi caricature is the real Nietzsche. Still difficult, still uncomfortable, still asking the question that never gets easier. Did you choose your values, or were you just told?